So I want to move on to a different subject that I remember I was talking to you and you said that you are a fan of horror movies.
I am.
Now, are you like a super fan or are you just like they're your favorite kind?
It's a tough one. Like, it's kind of that in between. Like, it's my favorite kind of a super fan. Like, I've collected some autographs over time. You know, I've got a little collection of things. So yeah, I get into stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So because I imagine that, like, it's funny. I actually today just rewatched a movie from I'll call it from our childhood. I rewatched I Know What You Did Last Summer.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Which back in the slate of Scream and
that was a fun it was a fun time in horror.
Yeah, well like Urban Legend and other things that were kind of reinvigorating the slasher genre at the time because it had kind of gone a little stale with Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and
because they were like, how many of this can we make?
Yeah, and it got to the point where those older franchises that, I mean, Freddy was always kind of a supernatural character because he was already dead and he was in your like a dream world. But Jason was supposed to be alive and Michael Myers were supposed to be like live characters.
But then they weren't.
And then they eventually and they would find ways to say like, well, it wasn't actually them in this. You killed somebody else. But whereas the new ones, because Kevin Williamson, he was the screenwriter for Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. And I think he also wrote The Faculty.
Oh, that was a good movie. Yeah.
Which is more of a sci-fi, like alien invasion.
It's more sci-fi, but it's still pretty good. Yeah.
But yeah, it really kind of, Scream was especially, because Scream was that meta movie that was like, this is how you survive horror.
Rules, like it had the horror rules.
Movie. Yeah. And it deconstructed all of the stuff that had previously happened in the last like 15 years in horror in that specific genre. So do you have a type of horror that is your favorite?
Oh, see, that's the tough part because like I'll get into something where, you start, it's like you'll get into the idea of like, oh, I love movies like, The Omen or It or like I really enjoy Stephen King movies a lot. That's kind of a whole, it's like, okay, so we have the whole Stephen King situation and you got slashers, so many good slashers. So it's really hard to like pick a genre because you're just like
or subgenre of the genre.
Yeah, you're like
because you have like supernatural horror or you have like the torture porn like Hostel, which are like
those are so good because
those are too grisly for me though.
Really?
I'm not a fan of gore. I'm not a fan of gore. Like to me, it's. I'm definitely I can get the point without having to see all of that.
Some of it for me is the idea of like I am always curious about like how much of it is practical effects and how much of it is done in post-production. So I'm like, oh yeah, bring on the gore. Like how much, like, so you probably didn't watch like original Terrifier.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I've seen some stuff just because horror is not my favorite genre overall. Like a lot of 80s stuff. So like The Thing, John Carpenter.
See, and that
was all practical
effects.
The Fly, David Cronenberg with Jeff Goldblum. That was, I mean, and those are fantastic movies.
So, and like those have there's a cool story and there's all of this, there's the suspense too.
Well, I think one of the things that makes The Thing, because I'd say The Thing is probably my favorite horror film, is because that movie was built more on the paranoia of who is the thing, and who isn't, because it can basically one drop of it can take a person over, and so it was this, and it was just such a great idea, and it was a remake of a movie called The Thing from Another World from the 50s. So, but obviously a fantastic cast led by Kurt Russell, one of my favorite actors when I was a kid. But even though that was a little too hard to watch as a kid, that movie still kind of scares me watching now.
It's still a good movie though, because I watched it. Gosh, what was it? Maybe like 6 months or so. When the theaters back home would do these, like, I forget what, it was like a throwback series where they're just like, oh, we're going to show old movies once a week. And I was like, oh, they're doing The Thing. I'm down. Like,
yeah, right.
I'll go watch that on the big screen.
And did you see the new one that came out like 10 years ago, 12 years ago?
I did, but
it didn't have the same effect.
Right.
Because it's CG. And unfortunately, we know with CG, it's it's just not the same.
Yeah.
You know, and the fact that it was trying to be a prequel that was explaining what happened at the Norwegian station, and you're like, but we already know what the end is. We know that a dog escapes and that it's pursued by a helicopter.
And that's that whole like prequel stories can be really tricky because you're like, but I already know this part of the story.
The outcome, yeah.
Yeah.
And but also prequels oftentimes will undermine the movies that follow it. It'll do something narratively or character-wise that you're like, okay, this doesn't add up to what's going to happen next.
Right.
Which is really like, I'll use, this is a silly example, but Monsters University, which was a prequel to Monsters, Inc. I don't know if you saw.
I've seen parts.
Okay. Well,
so,
anyway.
I'm not agree.
I'm just saying, it's okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point being, though, is that there's one part in the movie that kind of, one of the crux of it is it changes the whole relationship of the two main characters that was established in the first film. And you're like, so this doesn't make sense now.
Yeah.
Because in the first film, it was established that the two main characters knew each other since grade school. And in the new movie, they met in college. And you're like, okay, that doesn't square. So how am I supposed to?
Right.
How can I watch this now?
Right.
In any sort of
that kind of happened with
continuity.
The Orphan. I don't know if you watched Orphan.
I didn't. No.
So that's pretty good, and it's not super gory.
Okay.
Yeah. It's very suspenseful.
Yeah.
And they did a prequel, and it was kind of crazy because so it's about a child that a family adopts.
Okay.
And it's funny because I think that there's a case happening. Well, there's a documentary that came out that I think that the movie might have loosely been based on the original. But in any case, so this family adopts a child, and the child is actually 31.
Okay.
Ish. Like the child is a full-on adult.
Are you spoiling anything, by the way? Or is this stuff that people already know?
Sort of, kind of. But like,
I probably won't watch it, but yeah, I don't know.
But look, like, you can tell.
Sure.
Something's wrong with this child.
Okay,
the child is a full-on adult.
All right.
And there's some stuff that happens in the prequel where you're like, well, that's the continuity is all jacked up now between the two movies. But the fascinating thing was that they used the prequel ended up being filmed many, many years after the original. And they used the same actress to play the child, and they didn't de-age her at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but she's still I don't know what the deal is with this actress. She carries it pretty well. I'm like, how do you still look like you're like 11?
Yeah, that might be.
It's really spooky. Like she does, yeah.
Yeah, well, and sometimes that can happen where actresses or actors can still look really, really young and portray the characters that they portrayed.
She does it well. It's like, oh, that's creepy.
Yeah, that might actually add to the creepiness. So.